Welcome. In this video, we're going to be doing a review of the process for syncing invoices and expenses from Function Point to QuickBooks. This video will provide an overview of the process for syncing existing invoices and expenses. Please refer to previous videos to see the process for creating those invoices and expenses. I'm going to start by navigating to an Invoice Details page. We're now looking at the Invoice Details page for Invoice 126 for a job spring brochure for our client, Great Atlantic Insurance. We can see this invoice has a value of $6,600, and there's a button up at the top that says Unposted. Selecting this will mark the invoice as posted, which lets fpAccountant know that this invoice is ready to go to QuickBooks. Before we do that, I want to mention that the services that make up the invoice will need to be tied to QuickBooks income items. If no mapping exists, the system will not allow you to save the invoice. The field will be turned red, and you'll need to map the Function Point service to the appropriate QuickBooks income item. Once that mapping is complete, you'll be able to save the invoice. We can then choose to click Unposted, which marks the invoice as posted and lets us know that the sync will now bring this invoice over to QuickBooks. Now you can sync multiple invoices and expenses over to QuickBooks at the same time. However, in this video, we're going to be looking at the process for syncing one invoice and one expense one at a time. The next step is to open up QuickBooks and also fpAccountant. Now in my QuickBooks file, the company Great Atlantic Insurance does not exist. Neither does the job spring brochure. Therefore, the integration software fpAccountant is going to bring over the company Great Atlantic Insurance as well as the job spring brochure as well as the invoice 126. Any information that doesn't exist, such as clients and jobs, will be created by the integration. Any information that does exist will be used. Therefore, it is very important that the company names in both Function Point and QuickBooks are identical. I'm going to open up fpAccountant and choose to synchronize with FP. This is going to bring the posted items from Function Point into QuickBooks. Notice that the client was created and the job was created as well. Here's our invoice 126. And we can open it up and see it line by line exactly as we had it in Function Point. When you receive payment on the invoice, you would mark the invoice as paid in QuickBooks, and the integration will automatically update Function Point the next time you run a sync. That's the process for syncing over an invoice to QuickBooks. Now let's take a look at the process for syncing an expense. I'm going to go back into Function Point, and I'm going to navigate to an expense details page. I'm going to click on the name of the job, and I'm going to choose that job's financials tab. And I can see that we have an expense under photography that's PO49, entered on the 11th by myself. Triple On Interactive is the name of the vendor. $500 is our cost of the expense. The markup value to the client is $600, and this is the description of the expense that was purchased. Clicking on the PO number or the date will navigate us into the external expense details page. Notice up at the top right that there is a button that says Unposted. Just like the invoice, when we post the expense, that's letting fpAccountant know that this expense is ready to go to QuickBooks. Before we do that, there's a few things to mention here as well. One is that the reference number is required. This is going to be brought over into QuickBooks and is typically the invoice number provided by your vendor. The top level description is going to go into the memo description in QuickBooks. The subdescription is the description of the actual expense being purchased, and that will go into QuickBooks as the description of the expense. An important thing to mention is that this expense is going to go over into QuickBooks as a bill. And just like with the invoice services being tied to income items, the expenses need to be tied to cost of goods sold. If we try to post this invoice without the expense being tied to a cost of goods sold account, it's not going to go over into QuickBooks. We need to tie the expense to the appropriate cost of goods sold account. This should typically be done automatically. However, if the field is blank, then you'll want to make sure that you select an item. Click Save. We can now choose to post the expense. Just like before, if we open up QuickBooks and take a look at our vendors, we'll find that that vendor doesn't exist. Therefore, when we run the sync, open up fpAccountant, choose to synchronize with FP, the system is going to create Tripleline Interactive as a vendor in QuickBooks, and it's also going to add our expense. There's Tripleline Interactive. Here's our expense of the number INV21. And we can open it up and see the description of the expense, the memo description, the reference number, and all the information has been brought over from Function Point into QuickBooks, including the details of the vendor. Now, if any changes need to be made, you would make those changes in Function Point. For example, if we navigate back to the Invoice Details page, notice the status is exported. If we edit this invoice, add an additional $1,000, notice that the status of the invoice has been set to repost because we have made a change. The process is the same as before. We would open up QuickBooks, and it's important to mention that the invoice needs to be closed. Just like before, we would choose to synchronize with FP, and the spring brochure invoice of $6,600 will be changed to $7,600. There is the updated invoice. And there is the value of $7,600. The process is the same with expenses. If you need to make a change, simply make the change in Function Point, and the next time that you run a sync, that change will automatically be carried over into QuickBooks. That concludes this video on the process of using fpAccountant to synchronize invoices and expenses with QuickBooks. Please continue checking out more of our videos for more helpful information on using Function Point.